Well, I'll just get on with this show because it's a really important interview. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you have plenty of questions for the next time Ken Scott is on. Here's the interview. Welcome to Out of the Bag. This is Sean Maguire live on Healing Oracle Radio and People's Internet Radio, and this is a pre-recorded interview for my New Year's Day show, and I'm really honoured, so I am, to have the guest I have on. The two websites I've been giving are panterrapca.org and gemstoneuniversity.org as well. Two incredible websites that I've recently had a look at. But the main reason my guest is on the show is that Justin Zalewski, who was on my show not that long ago, and a few times actually, said to me in a message, how would you like to interview someone who has a lasting way out of our criminally run system? And I thought, oh my God, I definitely would love to interview someone that has that exact thing to share with us. So I am honoured to have with me Kenneth Scott from the Panterra Private Contract Association and Gemstone University. Kenneth, are you with me?
Yes, I am. How are you, Sean?
I'm very, very good, and I'm really, really chuffed to have you with me, Kenneth. Do I call you Kenneth Scott, or do I call you Kenneth Scott from the family Cousens? Sorry, go on.
Yeah. Well, you can call me all of the above. Generally, I go by Ken or Ken Cousens, and what people would generally first refer to as a last name. My last name is Cousens. And actually, Justin is from a Polish ancestry, as am I. And my father's original last name was Kuznicki, a good Polish name, and he changed it to Cousens, and that's how I am known. But there is a reason why I choose to go by my first and middle name and not attach the last name. So I refer to myself as Kenneth Scott, House of Cousens, family of Cousens, and we'll get into that a little later in the conversation, but you can call me Ken or Kenneth, however you wish.
Well, brilliant. I hear that you like to be called Ken, so Ken it is.
Ken it is, okay. Very good.
So for my listeners, we have an eclectic group of listeners, and obviously there's some new listeners who've come to the show quite recently, and I've gathered that from some of the messages I get. But for many years, I mean, I've been on the radio now for 9 years, Ken, and so many incredible people I've had on my show, also touching on, you know, the need to control one's own life, if you like, is the best way of putting it, and to stand in one's own sovereignty and not be, I suppose, dominated by the construct that exists. And I've had many great guests. I mean, I don't know if you've heard of Rob in the Family Page from Canada. The guys that made Esoteric Agenda made a movie about his life called Ungrip. And that's exactly what it was about, ungripping from society, from the system.
Actually, yeah, I've seen the movie. I didn't remember his name, but yes, I did watch that a while ago.
Yeah, so that's the sort of audience I have. A lot of them are educating me on a daily basis. So I'm sure that some will know your information and some will be itching to find out your information. They really will.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So real briefly, what is your background? Do you come from a background of focus in health, or in my context of law and world system, or combination, or how did you come to wanting to create this show in the first place?
Well, believe it or not, and I might as well tell you, and I'm sure a lot of my listeners in the past have heard this story before, but I'm a performing poet.
Very good.
Yeah, and I was a guest on a radio show nine or so years ago, and immediately after the interview that I had on the show, I think it was 7 or 8 radio hosts on that radio station resigned and blamed my interview for the reason for them leaving. I was then contacted by the people who ran the radio station, who weren't there to reprimand me and tell me off, but instead were thanking me for getting rid of people they were trying to get rid of for years.
Yeah.
So I ended up being asked, would I do a radio show? And I said, no, I won't. And I said it for a while. And then a little while after, I succumbed to their requests, and I said, well, look, if I can interview anyone I want, if I'm not edited, if I'm not censored in any way, and I can play whatever music I want and I can do whatever I want on it. And they said, yes, you can. So I've basically been interviewing amazing people. And the very first show that I did, just to put you in the picture, was Ireland is very heavily fluoridated in our water. And so my big bone of contention back then was to try and highlight the fluoridation issue. And my first guest was 2 hours talking about removing fluoride from our water. So from then on, it went to whoever wanted the platform, Ken.
Okay, very good. And have you had a lot of, now I know it sounds like I'm interviewing you, but we're going to switch roles in a minute. But I just want to get a context that helps context of your audience. So I assume, and I will proceed on that assumption, that you have a full spectrum interest range for your audience, from health to current events to history to law to freedom, sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely.
And so have you, but you specifically, have you researched or read to some degree, a large degree, or anywhere in between subjects? We could categorize the subjects I'm going to talk to as three all-encompassing and interrelated subjects: law, history, and money. So do you have a good background in that at this point?
Well, they are all interlinked, of course. My knowledge, I actually amaze myself with my knowledge, but it really is knowledge I've picked up over the years. But yes, I would comprehend what's going on in the judiciary and maritime law and all on the law side of things. And then I suppose on the health side of things, it can go from holistic to apoplectic. You know, I suppose I'm a jack of all trades and a master of none, maybe. I know a lot, and sometimes a lot of knowledge can be dangerous if it's not full.
Yeah.
So
we'll touch on that too a little later, because that is one point of focus as to. Because I come from that background of what here in the United States, and really originated in the United States, as the law movement or the freedom or sovereignty movement. I entered into that just pretty much exactly, well, not quite, but almost 30 years. And so in the late 80s, early 90s, when I started, it was very few and far between. And the people I connected to and found to study with were what we would consider the grandfathers of the movement, a few grandmothers, but mostly men, who had been bringing this forward in the 60s through the 80s. And so, we'll talk about that relative to that point of knowledge, when, the difference between knowledge and full integration, because there's a lot of people with a lot of knowledge, and what I always sought was a truly comprehensive and integrative, the integration of all of that knowledge and how it all works and how it fits together and where the real solutions are. Right. And there's a lot of pitfalls, as many of your listeners who have pursued this, I'm sure, know. At this point, our organization, which I'll describe a little later as well, we have members. It's a member, you mentioned, Private Contract Association. It's a membership organization based on private contract, and we have members probably in close to 40 countries now. So we're worldwide, and a lot of those non-U.S. members are in the Commonwealth countries, such as the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and so forth. So we have been working a lot with the distinction, the commonality of what the U.S. system is, and then the distinction or the differences as it would apply to people in your audience, being in Ireland and the UK and the Commonwealth countries. So,
and does it overlap, Ken? I mean, so much of British and maritime law is within the court systems in America, isn't it? Or is that just my ignorance?
Well, no, that's not an ignorant statement. And keep in mind, every time you ask a question, I have a very holographic mind, and see things very multidimensionally and spherically or holographically. So you just asked one simple question, but my mind just went into at least 8 different directions how I could answer that and integrate it. And so the answer is yes, no, and maybe. Because when we get into the substance of law, there are 2 fundamentals that are universal on this planet as it relates to law. And those are contract and jurisdiction. Yeah. And they're really complementary to each other, but fundamentally all law is contract. Yeah. And that establishes relationship to the bounds of a specific jurisdiction. Yeah. So when you ask about British law, English common law, and so forth, and you've already mentioned maritime, all of these things are what I was referring to earlier, that it's very important to have a truly integrated understanding of the comprehensiveness of how law really works. And you introduced me with our organization's website, Gemstone University, and that is where, as a private membership organization, people become members and have access to the private side of the site, where we have built over the last 6 years, which was built upon the previous 20 or so years of my research and work to integrate it all. We have built a comprehensive and integrative platform for people to self-direct, and also working with others through the membership to learn how the system really works. Because a lot of knowledge, as you already mentioned, can be dangerous. And in fact, when I reference those grandfathers who I studied, who came up in the 70s and 80s and were tremendous minds and research, and I had the benefit of some of the most brilliant minds in the law movement in the early 90s when I started. And the bottom line is they all went to prison, almost every single one. So I asked the question, why did they all go to prison? We'll get into that in a moment too. But the simple answer to that is they all went to prison because they were so brilliant and they had so much knowledge and they knew so many things, but they were missing one and basically 2 subsidiary major components of what they didn't understand. And that is the essence of what we teach our members. And I want to impart on all of your listeners and anybody else who comes across this recording, that unless you really know who you are and who you are not, to presume or to proceed on the presumption that you actually do know who you are can be fatal. And most people presume that, I'm a sovereign, I'm a free being, and so I can do what I want, and all I have to do is tell the system, go away, and so forth. And it doesn't work that way. And so the testimony of that is the experience I've had for almost 30 years, watching, as I just described, the most brilliant people in law and history and related things all go to prison. So the question is, why did that happen? So let's hold that as a question. I like to hold a question and then work around it. And where we're leading to in this conversation is to, I can, in the next hour and a half or so that we have for this conversation, I can frame out a comprehensive understanding of the what and the why and the how, so that it will give your listeners the foundation to understand the answer to that question and then proceed more cautiously in their pursuit of moving towards gaining real freedom, because that's what we're all after. We all know inherently in our being, in our gut, that we are supposed to be free, and the nature and character of this world system is absolutely the opposite of that. So to begin that conversation, I mentioned law, history, and money, and this is how I've defined that over many years. That History is the sequential unfolding of the creation of a system that we call law for the purposes of the final phase of creating a globalized system that we call money, for the purposes of binding the world population and extracting that population's life force or greater capacity force to be entrained and directed and controlled towards the extraction of the wealth of the planet to build a global infrastructure that is essentially a prison. Mm-hmm. And it is the people building their own prison and then fighting to get out of it, those who wish to get out of it, and not knowing how they got there because they don't understand mm-hmm. history mm-hmm. and law and money.
Yep. Yeah, and we're all bonded debt slaves, aren't we? That's what's going on, and until one recognizes what's going on, one can't, I suppose, be in a position to recognize our sovereignty and our power.
True and correct. So if I say this phrase, I would like you to tell me what it specifically means.
Okay.
Because you came close to it. You said bonded debt slaves, and that's true. But here's a more expanded context of precisely how that works in terms of law, contract, and jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. We are all bonded sureties to a bankrupt franchise.
Yes. Yeah, okay, that's much better. That's much better put.
Okay, now tell me what that means.
Tell me what it means. Well, it means. I mean, you see, there's that's where the knowledge kicks in as well. I mean, it means that we've been fooled, and our parents have been fooled, and we're part of a corporation, and we're part of I suppose a company that we didn't right. ever want to belong to.
Right. Well, yeah, we didn't. And at another level, we did. And that gets into the esoteric and the spiritual side of things, which is an entire other half of my entire life's pursuits. And I will weave that into the conversation as well. But I used 4 key words. And so you responded in a generalized way, touched on one key point of corporation, but specifically the 4 words: bonded, surety, bankrupt, franchise. Do you know what those precisely mean?
Well, I know what each individual word means, but put it together in context. What you're trying to get at, Ken?
Yeah. Okay. So let me ask you another question. How many corporations do you think exist in the world?
Well, it could be ultimately one, I suppose, but many.
Yeah, no, you got it right. There's only one corporation. All the other corporations are subdivisions, yes. corporate subdivisions of the one corporation. Mm-hmm. And that corporation is called the Crown Corporation. Yes. And that crown is held, as I'm sure you know, in the City of London, mm-hmm. which is part of a tripartite or a triple crown construction of 3 component parts, which are the sovereign city-states of Vatican City, City of London, and Washington, D.C.
Yep.
Subsequently, there are more sovereign entities, including the Universal Postal Union, CERN, the UN, and a couple of others. But those are the 3 primary ones. And it's called the Triple Crown, or Tri-Regnum, which basically was initiated and created or started as a testamentary trust in 1302, mm-hmm. pursuant to the papal bull called the Unum Sanctum, or you could call it the Holy Singularity, right. Or the Holy, the Sanctified Unity, whatever you want to call it. Okay. But that's a postulation that was projected into this reality in this world, and that has been put into place over the last 700 years. But it is only a projection of an offer to contract based on law, history, and eventually money, and it created a testamentary trust. Underlying that trust is a global estate, and it created a way to structure, hold, and manage all of that. And the primary purpose was expressed as that the papacy, or the holder of the so-called seat of Peter, the Pope, would claimed that he owned as an absolute all land, all flesh, and all souls. But it's simply a contract. It's a postulate. And it does not necessarily mean it's an absolute, because there's universal law that underlies that. And ultimately it led to one key point, which was that we've all voluntarily contracted into that, and we do have the power to rescind those contracts and remove ourselves. And the key is to understand exactly how it was constructed, so we know how to do it properly and we don't get ourselves into trouble.
Yes.
So back to the corporation. As I said, it's called the triregnum, which means the triple crown, or the 3 times royal. And the City of London holds the Crown Corporation that was there to hold all the land within the context of what I just described. It also is there to hold within the City of London the control of the global monetary and banking system, as well as the system of law. And on the esoteric side, because I was born a mystic, so to speak, I always just gravitated, even before I was like 6, 7 years old, to mystical things and esoteric things. Brilliant. And I pursued it my entire life, so well over 60 years. And so I understand the esoteric extremely well. And the esoteric is the hidden, obviously, by definition, but it's the flip side of what is seen in the public. And there's a purpose and a function for that in legal terms, as well as energetic and spiritual terms. And so what I knew a long time ago, and as I started studying law and history and so forth, and integrating it, I knew that if one only understood one half of the equation, meaning the physical, storyline of history and the physical, tangible reality we can research and study and come to know in terms of law and legal systems and codes and statutes, geopolitical structures, and the money and system and all of that. And if you ignore or don't even see that it's valid, the esoteric or the hidden, you miss the entire other half that controls the first half, right, as described. And therein also you will not find your way out of the labyrinth. And vice versa, there's many people who pursue the esoteric and they eschew the physical, or the, I'm not in this world, and it says be in this world but not of it, but I'm not going to be in it, and they fool themselves. Oh, I'm a spiritual being, I'm free, no matter what you say. Well, not really. No.
Should we not be in a position where, this imposed system of deceit that's upon us, can we not, I suppose, together, as a group consciousness, change that?
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry for interrupting, but absolutely, and that's the whole point. That's why we need to educate ourselves, because when our mind can penetrate through the veils and the obfuscation and the distortion of the facts that we're talking about, when the consciousness directed by a being who is directing his or her will into that consciousness, because consciousness creates and it has substance. So if we ignore it, it still has its effect on us, but we are not, in a standing position of awareness, and therefore we are at the effect of it. If we penetrate our consciousness into it, we now start shifting the balance to where we are becoming the cause. And we start shifting what we're creating in a controlled hologram through the matrix, and we start directing that by our directive will into creating a different reality. And so the substance of what created the matrix starts dissolving, which it is rapidly doing now.
It is doing that, yes. Yeah.
At this time. And so we're redirecting the substance of creation into what we want to create as a world that works for everyone, every being, every living system, and all the rest of it. And that's what it's all about. That's why education is not just for the sake of facts, but we are really engaging it on that basis.
I mean, now I've listened to a few of your videos, and I do recommend that people go to your Gemstone University YouTube channel. But you mentioned, or you talked about being a master puzzler, and you've got over 50 years of research to call upon. I'm wondering, have you found in all those years that actually that it was far more simple than you thought originally? Because what I'm finding is that a lot of people are trying to go down the way of deregistering from their birth certificate and deregistering from voting and all that type of stuff, and they're making mistakes, and they're doing it in a very complicated hyphen way. And I'm just wondering, have you found that it's actually quite simple, or is it that labyrinth you talk about?
Yeah, well, it's really both.
Okay.
There is no getting away from the fact that it is complex, and it's obviously purposefully so.
Yes.
Back to the esoteric, there's a overriding or overarching maxim that those familiar with that arena of esoterica will recognize, and that is the statement, it's hidden in plain sight.
Yeah.
And so it's all out there, but it's hidden. So that kind of reflects back to that phrase, for those with eyes to see. And so it is a journey of inner process, inner work, as well as using the mind to penetrate into that complexity. And as one does that, it does become simpler and simpler, because you have integrated it. You've integrated it into your being, and you've grounded it into your being. And at some level that we all exist at, as a much more expanded, much more powerful, capable being, that we already know this detail. It is the dumbing down. You mentioned fluoride, your first show about fluoride and so forth. It's the use of chemicals, from fluoride to chlorinated water to all of the stuff in the food and the water in the air and so forth. Yes, we have to deal with that. Yes, that has been done to dull the mind and create a sense of apathy within the body in order to prevent us from breaking through that. Yeah. But even with that, the power of our ability to heal ourselves, to cleanse, to detox using physical modalities as well as consciousness, that is there. And so in the Panterra Society and the Gemstone University, we approach it comprehensively as a whole being. The physical, the health, the detoxification, all of those sort of things, along with the mental activity. So, but to answer your question, those things you mentioned are important and essential. The issue, you call it deregistering, and we'll talk about that's not quite what we do. And this is going to lead us back to the bonded surety and the bankrupt franchise in a moment. And I'll explain exactly how it works.
Brilliant.
But so it is complex. It does require study. It does require moving through our resistance that we don't want to do that. Some have a great affinity for doing it. Others are much more resistant. But that's also why for what we created, we being my wife and I, created Panterra 20 years ago based on my work preceding that for 10 years and based on our life and work together, and before we met, the 20 to 30 years that we both pursued a lot of this kind of thing, that the essential ingredient that we knew, which is why we created it as a society, is the collective, that we can work together in the unified field that a group of people with a common purpose and common grounding and foundation, it does create a field that makes it easier that when you're isolated by yourself, It's except for the very few who could really break through it all, it's nearly impossible. So working together as a collective body, and that's what we've been doing with Panterra for many years now. We have many hundreds of members, and we have created and we're holding a unified field. And towards the end of the conversation, I will share a bit more of where we're at as the society and where we're about to launch into this new year that is going to really expand what we're doing and open it up for many, many people to get involved and build that unified field to a global scale that will in turn accelerate the influence and the impact on the consciousness, which is also, as I said a bit ago, that we're shifting that consciousness and that creator capacity away from recreating the matrix continually, moment by moment, to directing that energy to creating the world that we want.
That sounds really, really exciting, Ken. It really does. And I know that you've been at Panterra for quite a while, as you say. What's the difference between a private society and a trust?
Okay, very good. Hold that question because now I'm going to go back to to bonded surety. Okay.
Okay.
So, as we have established, let's take it as an established fact. There's one corporation. That corporation, over hundreds and really thousands of years, but we'll deal with the last 300 or 400 years, created a context called a nation state. And that nation state was defined in the 1700s primarily by a work called the Law of Nations. And that work came out around the same time as the United States of America was founded as a separate entity, but not necessarily an absolute separate country from Britain. But we're talking about the 1770s and thereabouts. So it established the Law of Nations and how nations were established and how they were and are still how they interact and operate within the context of a nation state. Well, then in the 1800s and into the 1900s, all of the established nation states were transmigrated to becoming corporations. And each one of those corporations was a subdivision of the crown. And the primary subdivision became the United States, starting in 1871, that created a new corporation and proceeded from there. That corporation was put into bankruptcy on March 9th, 1933, a few days after FDR was inaugurated. And certain key foundational things were put in place and tied back into other things that were established in law from the 1860s through into the 1900s. And from that point forward, the United States, as, again, Washington, D.C., was the completion of that triple crown. And the purpose of the United States as a corporation that was then put into bankruptcy was to create the binding legal monetary system to bind all flesh, because remember, we're talking about the declaration of unum sanctum, to declare and put into implementation owning all land, all flesh, and all souls. So the binding of the flesh happens with the legal and the monetary system and something called commerce, or a uniform commercial code that creates one specific thing. I'm sure you've heard of the UCC, correct?
I have indeed, yes.
Yeah, okay. So and many people pursuing freedom try to use the UCC in different ways, and most don't even actually know what it is. What it is very simply it's a mechanism to define the relationship between three things: secured parties, debtors, and collateral. So in a normal course of commercial affairs throughout the world, people have debt obligations, whether it's a mortgage on a house or a car loan or a consumer loan or whatever. Most of that is filed in UCC recordings, not all of it. But a UCC recording is, the first one is called a Ucc One Financing Statement. And it establishes who is a secured party, meaning who's the creditor, and it's secured against what? A debtor who's the obligated party, as well as the collateral. Right. So if I sell you my car and you give me $1,000 down and you owe me $4,000 remaining, I can take the car, put it on the Ucc One Financing Statement, list the details of it as the collateral, and your obligation under the performance of the contract, and you as the secured debtor. So expand that into the generalized universal monetary system, and every single event that takes place in our life through a commercial vehicle or a commercial vessel creates securities, securitized debt. And after the United States was put into bankruptcy in March 1933, the corporate Congress, now a managing administration or an executor of a bankrupt estate, started creating rules of administration. That's why the presidents are called administrations, because they're administering the bankrupt debtor in possession. In possession means it gets to hold and use the collateral, but it is secured against the interest of the creditor. Right. And so in 34, 35, they pass Administrative Procedures Acts, Securities and Securities Exchange Acts, Banking Acts, and so on and so forth. And essentially gave the authority of the Securities Exchange Commission the authority to manage, control, and regulate all securities. And ultimately, and then of course, if you're talking about a security, you're talking about a debtor, a debt servicer, and the collateral. Yeah. So essentially, from that point forward, all living beings who were birthed into this world of commerce were essentially had their birth event converted to a franchise. It converted it to a vital record that created something called a birth certificate, and a certificate is evidence of a debt and is also a form of a bond. And so the system of vital records at the county, state, national, and up to the international level created the inventorying of all of the franchises that were by definition bankrupt entities, because either already up to 1933 or from 33 onward into the 50s, virtually all nation states were converted into bankrupt national corporations, or national corporations that were put into bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. And so that birth record and so forth created a franchise. And that franchise had privileges and benefits, and it had burdens and obligations. And the benefits were that you can operate your franchise, that's your all capital letter name in the birth certificate, as most people know. And you can operate in commerce. And every single thing that happens in that name is creating a security. It's creating a form of a trust, and it's creating a form of monetized debt. And all of that debt is bonded, and it's certificated as a certificated record. And those records are what are used both in the public and in the private to create circulating medium or currency that is in the form of monetized debt, to create what you said earlier is the perpetual enslavement system. So the living being was put in a position to be the surety, which means the guarantor, which is equivalent to the debt servicer. And that's one of the privileges and the benefits. You get to use the system. You get to live off of it to the extent that it provides. But the burden of it is that you must service the debt, whatever it is. You must show up, whenever you're summoned to appear or any other variation of that. Mm-hmm. And you you are bonded to it. You are attached to it. You are in bondage because a bond is the evidence of a debt that's certificated, whether it's the primary certificate as the birth certificate or all the derivatives from that point forward, from traffic tickets to driver license to court cases, judgments, tax bills, utilities, and all the rest of it. And every single time one of those things happens, and it happens every single day, a new security is created, and the securities exchange has control over it. And because those securities are going to be exchanged, they're passed back and forth. I have Federal Reserve notes in my pocket. I go to the store, I exchange them for basically a receipt. And attached to the receipt is some commodity like bread and milk and eggs. Nice. But the receipt is the commercial instrument that the corporate entity called ABC Grocers is exchanging for my Federal Reserve notes. Okay. So it's an exchange. And all secondary exchanges are taxable. Primary exchanges, primary creation of a security is not taxable. Is one of the key things. So every time you go to court, the court creates all kinds of new securities every day, bonds, charges, all kinds of things. The IRS does the same thing. Inland Revenue does the same thing. Canada Revenue, et cetera, all the tax entities. They're creating a primary issue of a new security. And then once you accept it as the bonded surety and the debt servicer, that means then it becomes a secondary that's going to be exchanged, and that makes it taxable. And that taxability is for the use of using that security within the system of commerce. That's why they have income tax. It's not really income tax, it's a use tax, which gets into how trusts and equity and something called usufruct operates, which we'll go over in a moment. But this is where that bondage occurs. And the other level of it is that for the initial instrument, there are layers upon layers of auxiliary bonds that are created that are exchanged and traded on the off-book or the private system of exchange through the major exchange houses going through New York and then going through London and Beijing and Hong Kong and everywhere else on the planet. And they're trading those and they're making gazillions of dollars off of it that have nothing to do with real economy. Real economy is the creation of value. When a resource is extracted and its value added by being manufactured or whatever, or intellectual property, that's real economy. That's the creation of value. And so you've got this house of cards that creates this perpetual enslavement bondage system, because even if you go pay your traffic ticket for, $50 or something, there's millions of dollars of bonds that were created off of that initial traffic security.
Wow. So it's usury in the biggest way possible, really, isn't it? It's a fiat currency based with usury as its foundation. I mean, surely any economy should be based on trust and equality.
Right. Well, a real economy is what I call a parity economy, or a parity monetary system. Parity based on the word par, and par means equal value. So a real parity monetary system is one in which a unit of value is represented by a unit of measure. So the units of measure that we're familiar with are dollars, pounds, euros, and so forth. But of course, those are not one-to-one. There's no parity in it, because each one of those dollars that's created is attached to that whole complexified system that I just went over in just a very simple synopsis. But it's even way more complex than that. It's so complex that it boggles the mind when you really understand it. And it is abstracted into a realm of fiction that only exists in the minds of those who created it, and the creator behind those minds, which gets into a whole other level of things.
It does. Yeah. But we are all creators, Ken, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. So,
Yeah.
but hold that thought. We'll get to that later. um,
Okay.
so the So there is no parity in the current monetary system. It's completely abstracted from the substance of real creation. You know, the food coming out of the ground, the minerals out of the ground, the water flowing, the things we create, and all those things. That's real value. Services are real value, even if it's not tangible.
Yeah.
You know, if I do a service for something, it's my labor that has tangibility, but it doesn't create a product. So natural resources, products, manufacturing, services, intellectual property, those are all real value. And if we had a real world economy and monetary system, we would have a parity where each time that value is created, it would be reflected by a unit of measure, a monetary unit that can be circulated as a form of currency to exchange our value in a diverse system or a diverse economy. And it wouldn't have all these things that create a circular recycling system that essentially creates equity that's taken, that is pushed to the top to be owned by the few, and creating a monetary burden of debt, bonded surety position that pushes the burden of all this monetized debt onto the mass of the people. That is not at all parity, and that's not how creation works. And so when I refer to that, we are now removing our focus, the entrainment of our minds to be focalized into recreating a holographic reality called the Matrix that operates on something called Babylonian money magic. We are redirecting to creating a real world, and the imminence of something that's about to be able to be birthed, and that's part of the work of Panterra, which is a parity monetary system, and an open-ended creational capacity, unlimited, because the current system limits what can be monetized. It's limited by those who are franchised, who are given the privilege to create debt and take the benefits from the commercial arena. As you know, billions are disenfranchised and they're living on the edge of starvation and poverty. It's a very simple mechanism that creates this disproportion where all the equity goes to the top and all the debt goes to the masses. And in simple terms, in the current monetary system, you have taxation, inflation, and interest. And those are incremental but very inexorable and insidious mechanisms that never stop, that when monetized debt is issued, the debtor or the obligated party, like a Federal Reserve note, is a form of debt. It's a debt. It's a note, which is, by definition, is a debt issued by the Federal Reserve, but it never has to pay that because the interest, inflation, and taxation retires it in this endless cycle of issuance and then the burden of taxation and everything, and that creates the ever-inflating, the ever more fictional, abstracted, separated from life and separated from value creation system that was designed to create this endless, perpetual debt enslavement system. So that's the problem. That's how history, law, and money created this world prison and all of that. We could talk for days about that. But what I want to do, because we're at the end of the first hour, is spend the second hour focusing on the solution. How is it, okay, this is all well and good, and most of you listeners probably know a lot of this, perhaps not as precise as I've explained it, but where's the solution? So I'm a bonded surety attached to a bankrupt franchise. How does that work? Why does that work? Is it legal? Is it lawful? Is it constitutional? Is it in accordance with universal law?
Yeah, is it ethical?
Well, ethics is another question.
That's why I asked it. Sorry, go on.
Okay. Well, so we are a planet. We're on a planet. That planet's in a system called a solar system. That solar system is in a larger system, which is in a larger system. Eventually it gets to a galaxy, and that galaxy is in a multiplicity of galaxies in a universe, and that universe is in other interconnected to other universes, which is a multiverse. And then you could call it all cosmos. And so we're in this cosmic reality, and we're on one celestial planetary body. And so we, by definition of what I just said, we must be, we have to be, let's say, hardwired to universal law.
Okay.
Yeah, so what I and my wife and I in our work, because we do a lot of inner work and a lot of personal work where we are constantly scrubbing ourselves, so to speak, unveiling the layers, we're removing them, and it has opened up our consciousness, our awareness, and our capacity to integrate ourselves at a multidimensional level while still being very clear and very grounded in this 3D matrix reality. And you referenced earlier that I have called myself the master puzzler.
Yes.
And I am a master puzzler because my entire life I've had the capacity to consume, for lack of a better word. I have a voracious appetite to consume data and books and materials and so forth, knowledge. But knowledge without integration is, to me, doesn't get you anywhere. You can be a talking head on a radio or a TV show, or you can get a job in a niche or whatever, but it's integrative wholeness that I've always been after, and that's what I want to impart to others, to work together for us all to help each other break out of this matrix. And so I do have an extremely let's say, expanded level of capacity to remember a lot of the pieces.
Nice.
Whether I read something 40 years ago or yesterday, if it's relevant to the master puzzle of who we are, why we are here, what's really going on, and how do we get out of this mess. That's been my thrust of my life.
Nice.
So I've always had the capability to gather all those pieces and to integrate them. And I have described that at various points of saying, imagine you have very big, complex jigsaw puzzles, 10,000 pieces each, and you have a dozen of them, and you take them and you just throw them all up in the air, and they're just floating all up there.
Okay.
They're in plain sight. You have the ability to see every piece up there. But they're hidden because you don't have the ability to integrate those pieces. And they have to integrate at multiple levels because there's one puzzle that has 10,000 pieces. You have to know where each of those pieces go to create the whole picture of that one layer of the multi-layered system. Then you have, say, 9 or 10 or 11 other of those layers, each with its 10,000 pieces, and you have to know how those pieces and the pictures of each of those layers interconnect to each other. And that, for my process, has been the process of decoding the matrix in terms of the historical, legal, monetary, esoteric, multidimensional, spiritual wholeness that we are in. And so let's get back to universal law because it relates to what I just said.
Okay.
What we have determined and feel that it is absolutely true, this is our truth, if it resonates with you or anybody else, let's go with it, that this particular universe we're in, its foundational law is that all living creation is endowed inherently with sovereign free will. So when we speak of sovereignty, we speak of will, because we have, when we are truly balanced and integrated, we have a directive principle, and it is something we would call a masculine principle, because the nature of a masculine principle, not having anything to do with gender or any of that, but just in universal terms, masculine principle is directive. It's what we would see as in this world we're in as the electrical current of things. If you look at religion, money, politics, socializing, mind control, media, and all the rest of it, it is all designed for one primary purpose, which is to break the will of the living being and the collective whole. And look at religion. What is the primary Judeo-Christian construct? It's to get people to say and believe the phrase, "It is my will that thy will, a higher being above us, thy will be done."
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But is it a real divine principle that we're saying is up there, or is it an artificial Godhead that's been created by an artificial intelligence that is what drives this matrix, created it in its complexity and its seeming perfection of all these things like numerology and astrology and astronomy and all the rest of it that people are fascinated with when they get into metaphysics and so forth. Yeah. It's this perfect creation, but it's artificial because it lacks the substance of a living creational being who is whole as well as part of the greater whole of creation itself. So we have been purposefully misled to subjugate our will. Okay, and when we bind ourselves to the legal monetary system, we do it absolutely because we don't have a will within that system. Mm-hmm. We are subjugated to the codified bonding nature of the legalized system that we voluntarily contracted to.
Yeah, it's like it's our own fault, Ken, isn't it? I mean, we're consenting to these contracts that we don't really... Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word fault because, I mean, we were born blank, so to speak, even though we come from a lineage of ancestral genetics as well as our own life stream that's lived many places, many times. But we're born into amnesia. We're born into forgetting. So we didn't know the day after we were born that our mother was acting as an informant to put our substance of a being into a containment structure called a form, and she acted as an informant to put us into a registration. And the act of registration is to pledge property to the royal registry, which is where the word registration, regis, as in royal or regal, where it comes from. So our mothers ignorantly informed us and pledged us as property into that whole bonded franchise system that I've described.
So in a way, Ken, our parents received a receipt for us.
Well, exactly. Well, that's a very interesting point because you use the phrase usury, and the word usury, people think of, that's interest. Well, it is interest, but it's really a use payment to use something that doesn't belong to you. It comes from the Latin usus, U-S, and there's another Latin word called fructus, F-R-U-C-T-U-S. You can hear fructose. That's where those words come from. Yeah. So usus fructus means the use of fruit, the creation or the bearing of fruit from labor or some form of property value creation. And that gives us the word usufruct. Usufruct means the ability to use something that doesn't belong to you or that the title belongs to somebody else. And so usury is actually just simply a use tax. And when you call it interest on money, it's really paying a use tax for the use of somebody else's money. And that's actually what we pay when we pay income tax, because we are using their private script that is actually issued under a form of both bankruptcy and military occupation, which we haven't touched on yet. But it's all usufruct.
Yeah.
And the whole system is set up that we operate our franchise, our name, Kenneth Scott Cousens or Sean, whatever your middle name, Maguire is. You have a commercial entity, which is a commercial vessel that you get to float upon on the sea of commerce.
Yes.
And when you use that, you create property. You create something that is attached to that name. But that name is a franchise that belongs to the United States. And even if it's Ireland or the UK or Australia, they are all corporate subdivisions that are listed under the securities registry of the SEC of the United States or under something called the Companies House in the City of London. Mm-hmm. So there's two places of corporate registry. And Australia as a corporation is listed under the SEC. Mm-hmm. Canada as a corporation, same thing. And on and on and on. So we get to operate the franchise. We are bonded to it as the surety, which means we must debt service the public charges attached to the franchise, but we don't own anything of it, but we get the right of usufruct, or the use of the fruit of somebody else. We may labor to create that, but they own it because we have the privilege of using their franchise to operate within their bankrupt commercial corporate system. It's all about being bound or bonded to it.
Yeah, and it seems to be that they're using, like, obviously I look in the courts of law and they use the use of legalese, but across the board with Latin and various other things, there's a language battle, isn't there? One has to get your head around what these real meanings are.
Yeah, for sure. And that gets into the roots of words, which is referred to as etymology, and where that comes from, and understanding how it's used. And as an example of that, and this gets back to your question, what's a society? What's a private society? So let's take a moment to talk about that.
Okay.
So I referenced the Law of Nations that came out in the 1770s. That created the nation state, out of which was created the national corporation, out of which was creating the commercial function of creating commercial securitized paper issued against subdivisions known as franchises or smaller corporations that created capitalization that was all securitized debt, and then eventually what we call money. And so all of those corporate national corporations that all became bankrupt were put into a holding structure called the Union of Nations, or the United Nations, which itself is a corporation, which itself is also bankrupt. And all of them have central banks, and those central banks were the mechanism to issue the monetary mechanisms to bind the flesh of the people, so that they would be contained within the commercial monetized debt system. And each of those central banks were pledged to something called the International Monetary Fund. So you have a super central bank, and there you go into the global international debt system post World War II. And out of that, something called the Bretton Woods Agreement was created from 1944, when the UN and the IMF were birthed. And by 1947 or 48, something called Bretton Woods agreed to create the United States Federal Reserve note dollar as the reserve currency for every other central bank. So every central bank uses the Federal Reserve note as its reserve currency.
Right.
And then, of course, they created the petrodollar for the consumption of energy, attaching the energy consumption to the rest of the national and the domestic economies. But when I said that March 9th, 1933 is when it was all put into bankruptcy, that day, which was the first day of the 73rd Congress, the first act that Congress issued was something called the Emergency Banking Relief Act. And in that act, all necessary administrative management of the bankrupt entity known as the United States was put under the executive branch, or the office of the executive through which the president operates as the executive administrator of the bankrupt estate of the United States and all corporate divisions thereunder. And so in that act, it also said that basically all persons within the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof were under the control of that act and the office of the executive and everything that needed to be done to maintain the banking and the monetary integrity of the United States through something called public policy for the issuance of something called public funds. And all of that translates to your monetized debt bondage system that we're talking about. The key is that it says all persons subject to the United jurisdiction thereof of the United States, which is attached to the Federal Reserve note. So if the Bretton Woods Agreement put Federal Reserve notes as the reserve currency in every single central bank on the planet, and each one of those central banks issued a domestic currency that became bonded, monetized debt attaching to the living flesh of every living being, then they are all essentially through legal contract attached to the jurisdiction and subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. And so this is your one world currency, your one world system of monetized debt, and how this entire system was constructed to create a global bonded population.
Yeah. And why it looks like the New World Order, if you want to call them that, are planning on Catholicism being their main religion.
Well, yes, because again, it all goes back to the Pope. And that's a whole story. We definitely can't go into this first session together.
We've got countries with different histories. Obviously, I want what you're doing to be global. Obviously, I want everybody to get on board because I've looked at it and I think it's a fantastic way we need to change things. But we've all got different history. I'm aware of the UK with the fire of London and various other situations there, and the Magna Carta. Then in Ireland you have the papal bull that Pope Adrian, I think the first English pope, gave the Irish people to Henry V as a present. How the fuck that happened, excuse my French. But that type of history, going along with the fact that in 1918 or whatever, when we held a referendum in this country, a 32-county sovereign Republic of Eire was actually ratified by the Irish people, and the British should have left. But instead, obviously, George V just took them all out and shot them. And now we've got a provisional government. But a lot of people I know, all through my life and previous generations, only recognise the 32-county sovereign Republic of Eire because it's only been a provisional government since. Yeah.
And there is a solution to that, and there is a technical reason why they justify why they can do that. And as abstracted and absurd and duplicitous or whatever term you want to apply to it as it is, let's get into the power of accepting it as fact rather than polarizing with it and creating separation, because this is where the inner work comes in. And this is where my work has led me, and what we're doing with Panterra and the Gemstone University and things to come out of that soon.
Sorry, Ken, when you say inner work, do you mean spirituality?
Yes, spiritual work, personal work, but some people shy away from call it spiritual. Well, what does that really mean? And so yes, I make reference to it as spiritual, as I'm a living, eternal spiritual being in this body. I can give you legal and lawful context of how that operates because we reference things as a commercial vessel when we talk about the franchise, a vessel floating on the sea of commerce, and all the water and maritime metaphors and the maritime jurisdictional law system and all of that, it all interconnects. Remember, you're talking to the master puzzler, and any one piece that you throw at me, I can go off in 25 or 500 permutations
I best not
bring
send
it
you
back
on a tangent. I best not send you on any tangents then.
No, it's okay, because I also have the ability to track those and bring it back to the center point, which I'm bringing us back to. But the point is that whether you call it personal work, interpersonal work, dealing with the inner landscape, spiritual, metaphysical, whatever, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
It has to do with who we are inside this body as an inner being. The reason I bring up, the Sea of Commerce, commercial vessel and stuff, is because technically what they say is the bonded flesh is a vessel floating on the Sea of Commerce, in which the cargo that it's carrying, which is the spirit, is under an attached bill of lading. And for as long as it's not on dry soil land and it's still on the sea, then they would say we still control it under proper jurisdictional attachment of maritime and admiralty jurisdiction.
Right.
And when there is a bankruptcy is under admiralty jurisdiction, and therefore it is controlled by something called civil code, which is an adjunct of admiralty. And civil code controls the civitas, or the civil body, which we would call the public body. And this goes back to Roman civil law. And this is where the legal binding of you, the living being in living flesh, gets converted to a dead fiction and has the attachment of all these codes, because they're all civil codes. And under international law, civil codes of procedure are exactly what all these nation states that I described earlier, how they operate relative to the management of the conquered territory and people under all the military occupation of the global planet. Because Washington, D.C. is two things that I mentioned. One is the commercial code and the attachment through the legal monetary system. The other is the military, because we are all globally under military occupation. So Absolutely. We're under military rules of occupation and other things that relate to international law and certain treaties that were entered into in 1899 and 1907. Those treaties were called the Rules of War on Land and the regulations thereof. And they described how everything that I just described as maritime rules of war on the sea was brought onto the land, and how these rules will now apply to people and territory and property on the land.
Right.
And in 1907, in the second one of those, Article 55 says that an occupying force must apply the rules of usufruct to the conquered people and provide a method of management of the civil body. And the civil body is lifted into this containment field called Roman civil law and the civil code and the civitas. And you mentioned that the birth certificate is a receipt, and one of the 5 rules of usufruct is that a receipt must be given for the property taken. This is where they are following their international rules.
Yeah.
So the real key is, okay, we've been lifted off the land. We are presumed to be a ghost apparition floating in a vessel of commerce on a sea of commercial debt, basically, because when we're in debt, we're underwater, and all these water metaphors and so forth. So the key is getting back onto the land. How do we do that? How do we sever the attachment as bonded surety to a bankrupt franchise? Because as a bankrupt, and we are a bankrupt if we're the surety attached to the franchise, in all of those rules I just covered, a bankrupt has no standing in a court of law or a court of equity. Right. If you have no standing, you cannot state a claim. If you can't state a claim, you cannot stake a claim. Staking a claim means putting 4 stakes in 4 corners on the land. And if you can't stake a claim, then you have no standing on the land. And the law of the land is law. That's why they call it the law of the land. That's where your substantive rights are, not your watered down civil rights that are privileges that can be taken away.
Indeed.
So if you cannot have standing on the land, then you have no law. if you have no standing to state a claim on the land in law, then you cannot claim what's rightfully yours, which is the estate that underlies everything. You asked way back, what's the difference between a society and a trust? We'll get to that in a moment. But that's the key, that we must change our status. We must remove the presumptions of consent that have attached us by the appearance, by our actions every single day, that we're consenting to this arrangement. Because in universal law, and the principal law being that we are sovereign free will beings, then the only way a sovereign being can engage with anything else is through contract. And in law, contract makes the law. So we have volunteered to be contracted to this entire system that I've described briefly.
Yeah.
And the remedy is that we can rescind a contract. We can declare that we made a mistake, that we were not aware that when our mother registered us and bonded us as a ward of the state and, the surety and everything, that we did not know, because even though it was hidden in plain sight and it's all out there in the law books and everything, but we're not educated. We didn't know this. We didn't know that at the age of majority, we could have chosen to claim our estate and have standing in law and claim the equitable interests and beneficial rights in that estate and have that equity or equitable interest revert back to us and remove ourselves from the attachment of being that bonded surety and the debt servicer of the franchise.
And what do you say to people who are just, I mean, a lot of this system that we're living under is based in fear. Fear, I suppose, ultimately, of the system not being there to protect. Oh, you okay? You're right there.
That was actually the cat running across the floor.
Yes.
We have a very spunky little cat. He loves to run.
Right. Well, now my listeners know that it wasn't me and you hurtling books at each other or something.
Yeah, no. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the microphone on my laptop does work very well.
It does. It does.
Yeah. Okay.
But status correction. People are worried about changing their status incrementally. Because and I think that's the way you have to do it, because you can be attacked by the system. Is that true or not? I mean, that's the feedback I'm getting from people who have gone down this route and have tried to do that type of thing. And
yeah. Well, yes and no and maybe, and it depends how it's done.
Right.
And we left off a little bit ago about talking about the inner work, and I operate on a few very essential maxims that we derived in our inner work over a period of time and going through all the levels of things that we had to go through. And believe me, at the level that I can speak of all this now with a very ease of integration and all the rest of it,
yes,
that it took me literally 50 years to figure this all out.
Okay.
Remember this 10,000 piece puzzles up in the air in suspended animation. And because of being the master puzzler, I could hold all the pieces and eventually they all fit together.
Right.
And every layer that I went through, all those layers that all those teachers I mentioned earlier who all went to prison and they went to prison, and here's why: because they didn't understand the nature of status. They were doing all these things and they still had not corrected their status. And so for as long as you are still attached to that whole system I've described, you are bound to follow all the rules, all the codified rules that control the 100 million in the U.S. and many tens of millions in every other country, that require you to, because you have accepted the privilege and benefit of operating your vessel in commerce. And you do get the benefits. You get the benefit of being able to call 911 and have the police or the fire truck show up if you got a problem. You have the benefit of many, many things.
Yes.
But the commensurate or the parallel is you must carry the burden, which means you must pay your taxes, you must pay all of your bills, you must service all of your debts, and you must follow all the rules. And so my approach has always been to follow the rules and know if I'm doing something that for most people, they would say, well, you're not following the rules now, you're not paying your taxes or whatever, to know the reason why and be able to stand on it and defend it. And in the course of all this, I came up with these few very key maxims to understand this. And this is at the quantum level, at the spiritual level, and who we really are in these bodies, in these lives, and in this matrix. And the first one is this, which we've already talked about, but here's how it's said in a simple statement. That which is real can never, starts with broken. That which is broken can never be fixed. The matrix is broken. We all know it. We can see it. It's a broken system. It doesn't conform to true universal law, and it's breaking apart rapidly.
Yes.
But most people think we should fix it. But the fact is, it's broken, and that which is broken cannot be fixed. But that which is real can never be broken. So that which is real in true universal terms or spiritual terms, creational terms, it never was broken. It can't be broken. Okay. We've only been entrained to believe that what's projected out in this hologram is something that's real, and it's not. And
what's real, what's actually real, will replace this broken system, won't it?
Well, let's not say replace, because that which is broken can't be fixed, and that which is real cannot be broken. It's not a matter of replacing, it's a matter of dissolving or withdrawing our consent, dissolving our directive principle that's been focused on creating this false reality, and focusing on what's real. Well, what is real? Life is real. Well, what is life? Life is the totality of all being in harmony and balance and equity, where all life is honored, all life force is honored in every living being of any nature, and that, creation is unlimited. Yep. It can't be controlled. It does have to harmonize with all of life, but that's not control. That's simply harmony. That's balance.
Sounds good to me. It sounds good to me.
Yeah, and then the third part is focus on what's real, and the rest will fade away.
Yes.
Because we are the creator. We are creating this reality. So it's the reality that we have up to now consented to participate in. Is it the one we want to continue to create? So then the people will say, okay, fine. Well, that sounds good. That sounds like some sort of ideal. But where does the rubber meet the road? How do we do that in real terms?
Yes.
And you know what? We're going to leave everybody in suspense until the new year, because that's too big of a subject. And so we'll leave people to contemplate that, and we'll have to do round 2 and talk about that, because that is what my life's work has been about, is creating solutions, understanding every component part of how the matrix works, and understanding that it's an obverse or a reversed image of true reality.
Yeah.
So that all this externalized projected structure of artificial intelligence, artificial technology, everything that has inevitably been co-opted into a war machine of violence and destruction and death, because the entire matrix world system is nothing more than a cult of death. And I could take you through 5,000 years of esoteric detail, going back to Egypt and Sumer and Babylon and Roman history and biblical history, and it's all there, and it's all very definable and decodable, and it is all based on one thing. It's based on a cult of death. It's all out there. Everything is about death. And so now what we're living is the ultimate conclusion of a cult of death, which is the complete destruction of life. And so ultimately, we have an absolute responsibility to remove the presumption of consent, sever the attachment that we have allowed by consent of our life force to be entrained and projected into this false reality of death and destruction. And we have that power because we are sovereign free will beings. And so if you do not see the system as your enemy, and that gets into the second maxim that we've worked with for years, which is there are no enemies, only opportunities. Because the enemy construct is something that is actually internal. We have a polarization by many, many mechanisms, by our own creation through our ancestral lineage as well as our karmic lineage of our lineage of our own lives, and then the ancestral genetics of the body we're being in, and so forth. And then there's a whole lot of external manipulation. We're subject to vast amounts of unseen levels of things, such things as holographic inserts, genetic manipulation, genetic inserts, all kinds of things that have created a split in our being that creates a polarization internally. And when it is unconscious, it is automatically projected into the holographic field of this matrix reality. And how does that define itself? It defines itself in separation, and it creates an outside enemy, whether that enemy is your ex-wife or ex-husband, or the guy you got pissed off with on the road, or the banks, or the Pope, or religion, or the Catholic Church, or the Queen, or the money system, or ad infinitum, or Russia versus the United States, or the UK versus the Falkland Islands and Argentina. It's all been used to create projection of that internal split so that the population can be entrained through religion or race or politics and patriotism, to create the mobilization of the resources. Hang on a second.
That's okay. With as much division as possible, I think that's what they want. And the word enemy itself, I mean, it's quite interesting, isn't it, if you're looking at words and their construct. I mean, it is, your name is your enemy. It's just interesting stuff. Are you back with us? How's your cough?
Yeah, I just muted for a second.
Give
me one more moment. Keep talking.
No worries. I'm just letting everyone know that Ken has very, very kindly come on my show for the New Year's Day show. This is actually Christmas Eve, and he's kindly given 2 hours of his time, well, a bit more, obviously, with a bit of chat beforehand, for this show. So, massive, massive thanks to Ken.
Well, you're welcome. It's my pleasure. And as we talked about before we started recording, I am recovering for a bit of a cough and cold, so I did pretty good so far. But
You've been doing fantastic. You've been doing fantastic, so you have.
Thank you. So if we start from that universal principle that we are the creator, we are a sovereign free will being, and the only or the primary method of engagement, so to speak, in the creational field with other beings is the sovereign and absolute right to contract.
Yes.
So we actually, there's many, many levels where that operates, but getting back to the fundamentals of law that we started with an hour and a half ago, was that I said that all law is contract, and contract creates jurisdiction. And the word jurisdiction is two Latin words, juris, which means law, and diction, which means the word. So it establishes it as the word of the law, or what we bind ourselves to by contractual agreement. And that agreement creates a oath. And the word juris has another layer of definition, which means oath. And we can follow this all the way back to the origins of the setup to create the Crown Corporation to own all of the land. Because how did that get set up? It got set up with the landed gentry, or the aristocracy.
Indeed.
all of whom were regional, essentially warlords. They were counts and barons and earls and so forth, and the feudal system in which an oath of fealty or an oath of loyalty in which the sovereign, the king who held the land, and the lord, the count who owned a county of his landed estate, and he would create a contract or an oath of fealty establishing a bond of jurisdiction, oath, and so forth with the king. And that became the structure of a landlord. And those who hold the sovereign title, but still connected to the crown, holding the lording of the land or the landlord, and then lifting the serfs off of the land, or the civil body, as I said, to become landless peasants or serfs without land, and hence no law because they have no standing because they're not on the land. But originally, those who have, let's say, basically everybody I'm sure listening to this conversation through your radio show and millions of others in this world who have that sense of justice and equity, in the sense that things are not right here, and especially in terms of the destruction of the environment, destruction of animals and plants and oceans and rivers and trees and forests, and the subjugation of women and the destruction of the innocence of childhood through all the stuff that's now emerging to be known as sacrifice and ritual and all that nasty stuff. All that can be summarized in one simple statement, which is that we have a co-creational resonance with this world, with this earth. That means if you feel that in your heart and your being, you actually have a proper contract with this world. Because in a sovereign free will universe, to come onto a celestial or a planetary body does actually require a contractual relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything is contract, isn't it? I mean, even if you contract whether you want to smoke or have a cup of coffee or...
Right, exactly. Yeah. But we also are very clear that there's a lot of millions of people who are very parasitic, especially those at the top.
Yeah.
And those parasites came onto this planet without a contract. They came under rules of war, conquest, and engagement. And if you look at the entire legal history of this world for 5,000 years, as I have, you see fundamentally that it's a cult of death, and it's based on a system of war.
Yes.
And all of their current law is based on war and military conquest. But that military conquest is actually a improper, non-contractual intrusion of a parasitic consciousness, whether artificial or biological, because it's both.
Yes.
But it's a parasite that had no contractual right to be here. And it brought a whole lot of other beings who didn't have a contractual relationship to this planet and entered into contracts with those beings. And that's what you might call the first Faustian contract with the devil. Yes. And all these beings you see playing things out now. Hang on a second.
Okay, no bother. Totally understood. I really hope you recover very soon from it.
Oh, I'll be fine, but I'm probably running out of steam. The caffeine is running out. So,
well, do you know what? We can stop whenever you want.
No, that's fine. I can. We'll go about 20 more minutes. So,
okay,
because I want to wrap all this together.
Yes.
So, so those beings who we see playing things out now. You know, the absurd show going on in Washington, D.C. and what goes on in London, and what you described as a proper lawful referendum of 32 counties in Ireland. 100 years ago that the right of might that's in their coat of arms, that the British Crown comes along and says, well, you may do that, but we're just going to come in and slaughter you by military conquest. And that's what's been done worldwide. And that's called from the unum sanctum. You go into the 1400s and 1500s into other papal bulls that all told and all together create something called the Doctrine of Discovery, that said that if a crowned sovereign, meaning someone that the Pope coronated, which is the ring around the sun, that the Pope, who declares that he has some sort of absolute right to be the vicar of the so-called sun, and that's S-U-N, that's been religified into S-O-N. If he has the coronation authority to put it on the head of the king, and the king has a flag, and he gives the right to a captain of a ship to go across the water and claim any other land or board other vessels and create prize and booty to bring back to his sovereign, and the captain gets to keep some and give some to his crew, that Doctrine of Discovery says it doesn't matter if there's, hundreds of millions of living men and women and children in the Americas. They were not coronated under his so-called Christian authority, and therefore the Doctrine of Discovery. And if you read those papal bulls in the 1400s and 1500s, they say it right there. They say that those kings have the right to subjugate all of those beings who were considered non-civilized because they were not as yet put into the civil containment field to be bonded sureties to be attached to the system we've been talking about. Yeah. And they had the full right to subjugate, and if they didn't cooperate, just murder them and then actually charge them a fee for having to murder them because they didn't play by the rules. Those are parasites.
So is this why we have attorney generals and all military sort of,
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But the key is it's parasitic. We're dealing with the parasite on this planet.
Psychopathic.
But the good news is a parasite has no way to actually create. It only mimics the life template of the living creational being. Those of us who resonate with life, with the earth, with the beauty of creation in this world and all of its abundance of life, we are here by rightful contractual authority with this planet. And we, in large part, those beings listening to this discussion through your show, for the most part, are beings who probably came here a long time ago to help this world cleanse it of the parasite. And so what we did is we took on the clothing of the realm. We turned ourselves upside down, inside out, and ass backwards, and we took on the dysfunctionality of this world system. And we went through a vast amount of time in lineal descent and ancestry and lifetimes and so forth, so that we could penetrate our consciousness into the fabric of this entire matrix, which is why I said earlier why the study and the integration of what we're talking about is very important for us to break the hold of this matrix and do those things to correct status, sever the attachments, remove the presumption of consent, and all those contractual elements, so that we can literally break apart or dissolve this matrix system, which is not actually real. It's only a mirror image of the real living substance of life and our being and the planetary being and the cosmos and everything in between. So we have that power, and we are now taking it up. And that's what Panterra is about. That's what our education through Gemstone University is. And something we can talk about next time is that we are actually in the beginning stages of birthing a new monetary system that's based on parity, based on real value creation. And we are jurisdictionally very sound and very private.
Brilliant.
And we have been recognized as such, and they do actually leave us alone because they follow the law. And they leave me alone because I've corrected my status. I've had IRS agents come and try do things with me. I've had the SEC, the FBI, and probably many more who don't show up. But they all look at us. They all look at me. And there's one thing that distinguishes us, which they can't touch, which is we've declared peace. And if you look at our website, panterrapca.org, there's various components, our foundational documents and something called notices, public notices. And you'll see there that years ago we presented a notice of a declaration of who we are to all the world administrative bodies, from the Pope to the King to the Crown to the Lord Mayor and the President, and said, this is who we are. Do you have the authority or right or a prior existing basis to say we can't do that? And they never showed up. So we stand on that, and they have always honored that. And then individually, when you correct your status, you essentially do the same thing. And they can't touch it because the whole system was based on the adherence to that sovereign free will of universal law, that as long as you're contracted and you're voluntarily in that contract, they can do with you as they will. You're part of their club. You contracted into it, so they can do with you as they will. But when you say, wait, mistake, I made a mistake, you didn't tell me everything about it all, and now I know it, and I remove myself. It's a very simple statement of the steps you have to take, but it is actually pretty simple. And as you walk through the steps, you actually learn, and as you learn, you expand your awareness, and that penetrates your consciousness into this matrix that has held you in its claws and fed off you for millions of years and many lifetimes. And you break those bonds, and you start resolving the karma. And when we came in upside down, inside out, and ass backwards, we took on the clothing of the realm. Because we are so powerful, as we transmute that by becoming aware of it and taking the steps in this physical reality and the legal and the monetary reality, it starts transmuting the matrix itself, because we are the source of its creation, and so we can literally uncreate it. And that's what we must do, and that's what we are doing.
So it doesn't leave the individual who has changed corrected their status. It doesn't leave them, not floating in commerce anymore, but floating elsewhere on their own with no connection back to that system that maybe has fed generations.
Right. Well, there's several components of that. One is that phrase, be in the world but not of it. So we can change that and say, be in the matrix but not of it.
Yes.
So let's go to the movie The Matrix. What happened when they were floating around in the real world in the Nebuchadnezzar, right?
Okay.
They could project an avatar into the matrix.
Yes.
Right? And they could operate in the matrix. We can do the same thing. The matrix is made up of legal fictions. So we can create legal fictions and project ourselves through that. We can also set it up so that we can transit through the matrix under a principle of safe harbor. Hang on, something just...
Well, listen, it's absolutely brilliant that you mentioned that we can actually use the matrix, that we can actually use the system, and that we can actually, with knowledge, make sure it doesn't damage us. But, we have a certain
and this gets into many aspects that we don't have time for today. We can pick up next time, which has to do with estate law, trust law, what a society is, which I want to end our conversation, discuss that. You asked that question earlier, and I've been holding that back, and we'll finish up with that. But it gets into understanding, and again, for everybody listening, it sounds very complex, but I can assure you that it becomes simpler as you take it in and you start breaking the pre-programmed mind control construct of what you thought was real. And it only requires a willingness to let go. Mm-hmm. And when you're willing to let go, you start animating your free will. You start making choices, and then you start solidifying your being with your directive principle, which is your will. And you start grounding it into your physical body, which is the materia mater, or the mother of the material of our physical environment, which is the feminine principle. And the feminine, in a universal sense, is regenerative. It is continually regenerative, moment to moment, birthing and rebirthing ourselves continually in life. So we're the healing internally, when we say inner work or spiritual work, has to do with healing what has been broken apart, the feminine regenerative principle, healing the schism, which is the split of the masculine principle, to put our mind into a binary system, because we are controlled by an AI binary computerized system, and it controls our mind. And so we see everything through the lens of a polarized binary reality construct. That's the Machiavellian principle of divide and conquer, and internally that's the enemy construct. So when we start removing ourselves from the field of battle, which commerce is a field of battle, we remove ourselves from that militarized, polarized war machine, and what do? We go to peace. So Panterra as a society declared itself to be at peace. We sent a offer of peace and treaty to the Holy See, and they accepted it. Right. How do we know that? Because they didn't send it back and say, we don't accept. And so that's on the Panterra site that people can read. And so we declared peace. We go to peace. You must do that internally. And a lot of people, like you mentioned, Julian, and that you had interviewed him, and he was here visiting us when he told me about a week and a half ago.
Sorry, Justin, do you mean?
I mean, Justin,
yes,
yeah. We have a Julian in our membership. Anyway, Justin. So Justin was visiting us, and he that's when he introduced me to you. And, one night he was actually watching a video of some Irish man on the street screaming at a policeman, "Oh, you don't have a right," and this and that. And he was just totally going to war. And this is the hook. This is where they catch you, because the minute you engage in their military field, they control it and they win. And we have had vast amount of experience trying to convince people who've been in this law movement to go to them and say, you know what, if you stop the fight, if you pull back and you go to peace, you have 1 billion times more power than what you think makes you powerful. Because what you're really doing is, when you're in rage, you're expressing your sense of impotence, and you have no power there. And you can go to court and do all these things, but you're in their military field of battle, and you have no power there. You are a conquered people. And so it all actually makes sense, and it is simple. And to answer your question about how does one live their life? Well, this is what we've been building in Panterra for many years, solutions for how to remove yourself from the field of battle, how to set up avatars and other constructions so you can operate in the matrix and hold assets or hold accounts and so forth, and be able to live. Because in the United States, in my 30 years experiences, there are a lot of people who, quote unquote, are free, who didn't go to battle so much, and they figured it out, and they didn't go to prison. But most of them have nothing going in their life. They're completely ineffectual. They're free. They get pulled over. The cop can't give them a ticket. They don't pay taxes, all those things. But they have no real force and effect in the world.
I've plenty of friends like that, yes.
Yeah, and the Matrix is happy to say, okay, you're free, but you're inconsequential. Well, I came into this world to actually change it and make an impact so that we could rebuild or reanimate and bring forward the real world, so that the false world that's broken would dissolve. And to do that, we must have the substance of the world. We must have money, capital, the things that move real things in this world. And that's what we'll talk about next time, what we have arrived at with things that are quite extraordinary in offering a quantum scale solution, meaning that we're not going to have to do onesies and twosies. We're going to be able to start moving large numbers of people through this process to return, to remove themselves from being lost at sea.
Yes.
To get onto the land, to have standing on the land, to hold the law, and to have the ability to state a claim, to claim their living substance, their inherent right to be living here totally and absolutely free as a sovereign free will being, and to actually be functional in building and healing this world.
Well, I think that's why we're all here at the moment, Ken. And
Yep.
honestly, fantastic to know that you exist. I didn't know Panterra existed before Justin Zalewski told me about you. I didn't know about the Gemstone University. I want everyone to check out the two websites, panterrapca.org and, of course, gemstoneuniversity.org as well. I really want to get involved at some stage, so maybe that's why Justin put us in contact with each other, Ken.
Yes.
I'm absolutely thrilled that you've come on the show, and I want to thank you so much. As I said, I'm a poet, and it's my New Year's Day show, and I was asked by a friend of mine to read a poem, so I thought the best way to do that was to be asked my wonderful guest, would you like to hear a poem?
I would.
Have you anything else to say before?
Yeah. We're going to cover one more thing.
Go for it.
Okay, remember. Okay. And also, I'm a poet too.
Good man.
Okay. So I would love to hear a poem from you, and I would like to share a poem from me.
I'd be honored. Brilliant.
Okay. And I would like to definitely set this as the first of a unnumbered amount of future conversations, because I feel very definitely connected with you. I enjoyed this, and we can continue to expand on it and get into more detail for your listeners, and we'll put it on the Gemstone University YouTube channel and so forth. And there's a lot more, not only in the detail of history, law, money, and all the rest of that, but more importantly, actually, is where we're at and what we're about to enter into, because we are definitely entering into a new level of acceleration of the healing of this world and ourselves, and the removing of this parasitic overlay that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I hope so much.
So the last thing, just to wrap it up, you asked in the very beginning, you asked it in the form of, what's the difference between a private society and a trust?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to really answer the trust part, because we'll leave that for next time, but trusts are a part of equity. And there is something in the law of equity called the 20 maxims of equity. And we can start next show talking about the maxims of equity. And when I speak of universal law, I'm speaking of universal equity. Equity is balance, equanimity, harmony, and all the rest of that. And it is hardwired in the world system of law, but it has been removed from access of almost everybody on everybody on the planet, because for as long as you're a bonded surety to that bankrupt franchise, the only legal system you have available is the civil code. And the civil code is only about mariners, merchants, and their property.
Right.
And in that UCC civil code system, who you all are is property. So when you go into court, all they're doing is adjudicating for the public policy and the public funds under bankruptcy and military occupation, the property that's pledged as collateral to that bankrupt estate. Mm-hmm. So if you don't want to be property of this parasitic system, this martial, warring, destructive cult of death, then your only choice is to remove yourself from that and walk back into the living real world. Mm-hmm. So that gets into equity and trust law and all that. We'll talk about that next time. But a society, all, say, aggregations or gathering of beings together is considered a society. all secular systems of government and national identity are set as societies. I talked about the law of nations, and the very first article or clause in it starts by saying a nation is a group of men as a society who come together for a common purpose. Of course, men excluded women 200 and so years ago, but it established that a nation is a society. Yes. All religious entities are a society. The church calls itself a society.
Yes, yeah.
There are corporate societies that are public entities, like the American Cancer Society or the Society of Retired Persons or things like that. Many, many societies, but they're all set up as corporations. They're given tax exemption, so they're given that benefit to be a corporate commercial entity, and they're called a society or a foundation or a 501c3, things like that.
Yeah.
But there can also be a private society. There is no rule that limits people from coming together as a private society. And this goes back to the origins of their entire Judeo-Christian geopolitical construction, and it's called an ecclesia. And an ecclesia, or the word ecclesia, is the root of the word ecclesiastical. Of course, we think of that in religious terms, and the word religion in Latin means to bind again. So we've been talking about bondage. So when you come into a religion, you are accepting a contract to be bound to it. And there are many forms of religion, not just Catholic and Hebrew or Jewish and Islam and so forth. The medical system is a religion. They are priests. The judicial system is a religion, yeah. So on and so forth. So that's all on the public side. Those are religious or secular societies. But we have the right to form an ecclesia, which means in the root of the word, in Greek, it means a body set apart or a body of the congregation. Congregation does not have to mean religion. It just means two or more come together and form a larger whole and create a body, a living body of two or more. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that's the esoteric meaning of that phrase attributed to Jesus in the Bible, when two or more come together in my name, but it has nothing to do with the overlay of the religious construct that was created by the Catholic Church to create the Savior Messiah complex that everybody's entrained into binding themselves to, and thus giving jurisdiction to that church. It meant esoterically that when you set yourself apart, you remove yourself from the Roman civil system, the Babylonian money magic system, or the bonded commercial debt system of mariners and merchants, that you remove yourself from it, you walk back into life out of the system or the cult of death, and now you become, when you come together with others, you become an ecclesia. And so we have the right to form a society, and then a society has the right to create its own court, its own law form, its own jurisdiction, its own treasury, and its own form of basically self-governance. That's what we have done with Panterra for almost 20 years. And out of that, we did form a court. And that court is called the Panterra de Oro Court of the Ecclesia being the living body of those living beings who have walked into life, who have removed themselves from the cult of death and are standing in life
in the society
and all the rest of what we've talked about. And so then we have standing on the land to establish our law. And this is where we're going with this. And out of the court of the ecclesia, we are continually birthing more private societies. So you can form a private society even if you haven't corrected your status, and you can hold in the jurisdiction of Panterra the substance of what you create with the layering of avatars and other entities that we've done. And that's all in our education and the guidance that we provide for our members. Right. So that's what a private society is.
Very good, and it's brilliant. And so the Gemstone University is really a networking site, I suppose, full of information.
Yeah, and we network amongst members, and we have members in probably at least 35 to 40 of the U.S. states and almost all the Canadian provinces and all the major Commonwealth countries, and probably total of about 35 to 40 countries. And next time we come together, we'll talk about equity, the maxims of equity, how to understand this more, and we'll talk about what Panterra and Gemstone is launching to expand our capacity to provide this education and solutions for anybody who wishes to take this step as we've described.
Fantastic. And I'm honoured you're on, my radio show, Out of the Bag. I've been on People's Internet Radio for the last 9 years, recently joined with Healing Oracle Radio. But People's Internet Radio's catchphrase really is that we are seeking solutions. And that's exactly what you've been giving us, and possibly are giving to every individual that checks you out. That, basically we need to do this individually, but obviously as a group globally, wouldn't it be wonderful if we can become a power and have a currency that's bigger than the dollar, for example?
Absolutely. Nothing in our way.
I don't think so. I really think we should just go for it. Ken, it's been absolutely amazing and brilliant, and I didn't realise that the 2 hours would fly so much. I know that you're not well, so we're going to knock it on the head, of course, until the next time you come on, which I hope is only going to be maybe a month down the road, or whenever you're free. We can do it again. Can I hear a poem from you, or do you want to hear one from me before we go?
Well, let me see. I'm looking for... hang on, I'm looking through my computer for... I just switched things over to a new computer, so...
Okay.
Hang on. No, actually, why don't you read yours? Okay, I found what I'm looking for, but go ahead and you read yours first.
What I want to do for you is a bit of numerology, astrology, karma, the whole bloody lot. Let's use it. Synchronicity. Would you be willing to pick a number between 10 and 90 and not let it mean anything at all? Just let the universe give you a number between 10 and 90.
And I should say it out loud.
Oh, you should do. We're on radio.
Oh, I can't hold up fingers at everybody. Okay. How about 77?
77. Okay, well, I've got a little book called Out of the Bag, a selection of poems by myself. And I'm going to go to page 77. And I'm going to read you the poem. Let me see. Here we go. Wow. Well, I wrote this many, many years ago. It starts on page 76. And it goes on to page 77, and it's called It Looks Like Evil's Won. And it goes like this. When I was a small child, I don't know about you, I listened to my elders and believed them to be true, told to speak when spoken to only, and not say what I could see, only made me doubt them, question them, because I saw so much hypocrisy. I saw men of the cloth and women just the same, doing the most unspeakable things, yet speaking in God's name. If the things they did were holy and their acts were justified, I wanted to have a word with God, and believe me, I have tried. To tell him that he's got it wrong, if he agrees with what they've done, the hell his church puts children through makes it look like evil's won. There you go.
Very nice.
So
Very good. Well, I'm going to take this opportunity because I actually rarely have have the opportunity to read poems out loud, and I haven't really written much poetry in probably 30 to 40 years.
Okay.
So I'm going to read two poems.
Go for it.
And both of these were written between 30 and 40 years ago.
Okay.
So the first one is called Today. One day, a soldier awoke and wondered at his being so far from home. He looked about him to find no trace of those who he loved, or those who loved him. Nothing of comfort to touch, and only the querulous machines of war. Blank faces all around him with vacant stares reflected his fear and his loneliness, and gave him to wonder at the idiocy of those who had sent him so far away from home. One day a soldier awoke, and beside him another smiled. Together they wandered into the sunshine, no longer wondering at their being so far from home. Together they dismantled their guns, and they joined arms in loving embrace, walking away from the silly folly that had brought them to make war so far away from home. One day an army awoke. They turned to their generals and they said they would fight no more. Joining hands, they walked into the sunshine, planting trees and healing the scarred ground they had trampled not long before. They stretched hands across the waters, and their enemies became their brothers. Together they walked across the globe, healing the tired and the sick and the hungry, planting new gardens where once their machines of war had scorched the ground. And they marveled that they had been so long away from home. One day humanity awoke and kissed the sky and blessed the ground. One day humanity awoke as if it had awakened from a long and terrible dream. One day humanity awoke and understood that they were finally home. One day humanity awoke. One day. Today.
Great stuff. That's lovely.
Thank you.
I love it. I really loved it. And you've got another one for us.
Yes, one more.
Okay.
This is called The Living Light.
Okay.
That you might be the living light of love. For this have you come to walk upon this ground, that you might taste of the fruits and the abundance of all that lay before you, to imbibe the simple draught of love that shall nourish and sustain you, that shall quench the thirst that has pursued you through all these years, that will wash over you as the waters of the clouds that pour forth their living breath to cleanse and purify. All this and much more, for this have you come. To be as the radiant one, standing forth fully clothed with the raiments of heaven woven upon the loom of this earthly plane, to touch sweet innocence and ignite your heart more brilliant than the brightest sun, each and every living cell like unto the whole, so that the greatest and the smallest shall be as one. For this have you come. Be ribboned with joy like a summer prize. Thus shall you be resplendent and free, in all manner of ways countless as the stars of the night, the droplets of the seas, gentle as the summer breeze and tender touch, ever much like unto the child that you are, grand as the magnificence of a star that sparkles with your one and only light, forever into day and night. For this have you come. Bluest of blue and deepest of deep shall lay gentle upon your mind as you fold softly into sleep. The richness of sky and the fathomless sea, to these shall you cast the burden of your fears, the sorrow of your years. And after winter, so too comes the spring, and the birds shall sing, and the sun shall rise. The grass shall spread evergreen upon the hills of yonder dell, where shall rise a citadel wrought of crystalline glass, where shall never pass any heart saddened or stained, nor memory twisted or pained. For this have we brought witness to the singing streams and the laughing winds and the running deer. For this are we here, and for this have you come. That you might be the living light of love upon which all eyes might peer, unadorned and ever clear, radiant as the one sent forth from the sun, recognized as we, known again for all to see, all glory in all laughter and all tears, glory in touch and taste and sound and smell. For this we shall know so well in every nerve and every cell, singing clear as the bell that rings from yonder tower, and thus shall each glowing heart know the hour, be it ever present in every breath, in every breath, every breath. For this have you come, oh indeed, for this have we come.
Wonderful, wonderful stuff. I'm humbled, so I am, Ken. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And what a couple of hours, and finishing off with a bit of poetry as well.